Imagine walking into the glitz and glamour of a high-profile gala, where every glance and every move you make is under scrutiny. The lights, the music, the laughter, it's everything you've dreamed of. You feel like you belong. But then, in an instant, everything changes. A simple misunderstanding spirals into a nightmare that no one could have predicted. You're accused of something you didn't do, and your entire life is thrown into chaos. This is exactly what happened one evening when a man found himself at one of the most prestigious events of the year. The venue was buzzing with the kind of energy that only comes from the wealthiest and most influential people gathering in one place. The air was filled with laughter, expensive perfumes, and the clinking of glasses. The man, just like everyone else in that room, was there for a good time, maybe even a chance to connect with people who could help further his career. But then, in a moment of confusion, someone pointed at him. The words came out of nowhere, "He stole it." The accusations rang out in a crowded room full of strangers, turning the man's entire world upside down. No one asked questions, no one listened to his side. They just saw what they wanted to see, and the idea of a crime being committed became a reality, no matter how far from the truth it was. The whispers started. The eyes of the room shifted towards him, each one holding a mixture of judgment and suspicion. He could feel their gazes burning into his back, their silence growing louder with every second. And just like that, his night, a night that was supposed to be filled with potential and promise, became a blur of confusion and fear. But what if this wasn't just an unfortunate mistake? What if there was something deeper at play here? Something much darker than a simple accusation? What if the man wasn't the only one who had been deceived? As the night wore on, the walls of the gala began to close in on him. The more he tried to explain himself, the more his words seemed to fall on deaf ears. The truth, as unbelievable as it seemed, was buried beneath layers of assumptions and false beliefs. Those who had once welcomed him into their world now turned their backs, each of them caught up in their own version of the truth. He was a man without a voice, without allies, fighting to clear his name in a room that seemed determined to make him guilty. But there was something in the way he held himself, something in his eyes that told a different story. This wasn't just a man who had been falsely accused. This was someone who was about to uncover a truth that would shock everyone involved. A truth so powerful, it could change everything. Was it just an unfortunate case of mistaken identity? Or was there something more sinister going on? The pieces didn't quite fit, and the closer he looked, the more the story didn't make sense. The clock was ticking, and he had little time to figure out who he could trust, who was pulling the strings behind the scenes, and most importantly, why this was happening to him. The tension in the air was palpable. No one could shake the feeling that there was more to this story than anyone was willing to admit. And just as the final accusation was made, with the man on the verge of being escorted out by security, something shocking happened. Something that would change everything. But to uncover the truth, he would have to risk more than just his reputation, he would have to risk everything. The mystery surrounding the gala, the accusations, and the people involved was far from over. What really happened that night? And who was behind the scenes pulling the strings? The truth, as unimaginable as it seemed, was right around the corner, and it was about to reveal itself in a way no one could have ever expected. This is only the beginning. The real story is just about to unfold. The atmosphere of the gala had started to feel suffocating, as if the very air around him was thick with suspicion. The man, still reeling from the shock of being accused, stood frozen in the middle of the grand ballroom, surrounded by people who had once been strangers but now seemed like the coldest of enemies. The ornate chandeliers above him flickered slightly, casting long shadows on the polished marble floor, which seemed to stretch out endlessly. Each step he took felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of the accusations was anchoring him to the spot. He looked around, hoping for some sign of support, but everyone seemed either too busy pretending nothing had happened or too absorbed in their own conversations to notice the storm that had just erupted. His heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to remain composed. This wasn't the time to lose control. He had to stay calm, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized just how little control he actually had over the situation. Who had made the accusation? He scanned the room again, trying to find the person who had started it all, but there were too many faces, too many unfamiliar eyes. And no one was willing to meet his gaze long enough to offer any answers. The whole thing seemed like a nightmare. It was as if, in the blink of an eye, everything had turned upside down, and he was standing on the edge of a cliff, with nothing but a swirling abyss below. His thoughts raced as he tried to piece together what had happened. He had arrived at the event, a prestigious gala that promised an evening of fine dining, connections, and opportunities. A chance to mingle with people who could help him take the next step in his career. It wasn't just any gala, this was the kind of event where the right conversation could change your life. He'd been invited because of his work, his potential, and the impression he had made on a few key people. It had been a dream come true, but now it felt like that dream was slipping away from him. He remembered the moment it all started to go wrong. He had been standing by the bar, enjoying a drink, when someone bumped into him. It was an accident, nothing more. The man had apologized, and they'd exchanged a few pleasantries. But seconds later, the atmosphere shifted. A woman someone he didn't know had walked up to him, looking at him with a gaze that was sharp and filled with judgment. Her voice had been soft but firm as she accused him of something that didn't make sense. At first, he thought he had misheard her. But when the words sank in, when the words he stole it echoed in his ears, the room seemed to go silent. He tried to speak, to explain, but her eyes never wavered. She pointed to a small, intricately designed bracelet she was wearing. The accusation was simple, he had stolen it from her. He was taken aback. He didn't even know who this woman was, let alone why she would think he had taken anything from her. But there was no time to question the logic, no time to try and understand. The people around him, strangers to him, all had already begun to react. Whispers spread like wildfire. The whispers turned into murmurs, then louder voices. Some people looked at him with pity, while others with a sort of quiet anger. He could see their eyes narrowing, judging him, waiting for him to break down and admit his guilt. He opened his mouth to defend himself, but his words got lost in the noise. He had no proof of his innocence, nothing but his own word against the growing sea of accusations. The more he tried to explain, the more ridiculous he seemed. And then there were the security guards. He noticed them moving toward him, eyes locking onto him with a firm, unwavering gaze. They weren't there to help him. No, they were there to remove him. His stomach twisted in knots. The realization hit him like a blow to the chest. He wasn't going to be heard. He was going to be silenced. But who could he trust? In a room filled with the city's most powerful people, who would stand by his side? He had no allies here, no one who would risk their reputation for a man they barely knew. The odds were stacked against him, and he knew it. All he had left was his own determination, a growing sense that there was more to this than just a simple accusation. There was something wrong here. Something off. But what? As the security guards closed in, the man's mind raced. He had to get out of there. He had to figure out what had happened. He needed to know who was behind this, and why. But he couldn't just walk away. He couldn't let these people think he was guilty when he knew he hadn't done anything wrong. His reputation, his life, was on the line. And there was no way he was going to leave without at least trying to get to the bottom of it. He glanced around, hoping to spot someone who might help, someone who might offer a lifeline. His eyes landed on a figure in the corner, someone who had been watching the entire scene unfold with an expression he couldn't quite place. It wasn't pity, or anger, or any of the emotions that filled the room. It was curiosity. This person didn't seem ready to judge him just yet. Maybe this was his chance. He started moving toward them, careful not to draw too much attention. The security guards were getting closer, but he had to take the risk. He had to speak to someone who might understand. As he approached the figure, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for whatever conversation was about to happen. But just as he was about to speak, the woman who had accused him earlier stepped into view. She was holding her bracelet up, her fingers gripping it tightly, as if to make sure it was still there. She looked at the man, a smile creeping onto her lips. The smile didn't reach her eyes. "You didn't think you could get away with it, did you?" she said, her voice cold. "I know what you did." The words hit him like a slap, and for a moment, he couldn't speak. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. The woman had no reason to accuse him. He had never seen her before, never had any reason to interact with her. So why was she doing this? But before he could respond, she turned away, heading toward a group of people in the corner. They all looked at him as she approached, their eyes flashing with a mixture of suspicion and judgment. They knew nothing of the truth. They had no idea what was really going on. And yet, their eyes condemned him, as though he were already guilty. The man stood there for a moment, paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of injustice. He had to get out of there. He had to find out who was behind this and, more importantly, why this was happening to him. But as the security guards closed in around him, his heart sank. He knew he couldn't stay here. He had to leave, and he had to leave now. But as he was about to make his move, a voice called out from behind him. It was a low whisper, barely audible above the noise of the gala, but it sent a chill down his spine. "You don't want to leave just yet. The truth is closer than you think." The man froze. He recognized the voice, though he couldn't place it. He turned quickly, but the crowd had swallowed the speaker whole. Whoever it was, they had vanished. The mystery was deepening, and he was only just beginning to realize how tangled it had become. The man's pulse thudded in his ears as he scanned the room for the source of the mysterious voice. Whoever it was, they hadn't been standing anywhere near him a moment ago. The crowd had already swallowed up the speaker, and there was no sign of anyone who could have whispered those words. His heart raced, each beat heavy with the weight of uncertainty. The tension in the room was suffocating, and yet, it was a tension that felt far too deliberate, far too orchestrated. The gala had once felt like a golden opportunity, a chance to make connections, to climb higher in the world he had worked so hard to be a part of. But now, it felt like a trap. Everywhere he turned, people were watching, waiting, judging. He had no idea how deep this went, or who was behind it, but he knew he was entangled in something far bigger than a simple case of mistaken identity. The security guards were still near the edge of the room, their gaze fixed on him, waiting for the next move. They weren't there to help, not anymore. He could feel their eyes tracking him, closing in like predators waiting to pounce. He couldn't go anywhere without them noticing, but he also couldn't just stand still. Something wasn't right. He could feel it in his gut, a gnawing sensation that refused to go away. The accusation, the whispers, the way everything had unfolded, it all felt too coordinated. Someone wanted him out of the picture, but why? A part of him wanted to walk out, to let the case be someone else's problem, but he couldn't. Not when he had no idea what had just happened. Not when there was so much at stake. His name. His reputation. His future. All of it was hanging in the balance, and he couldn't let it slip away without knowing the truth. He glanced around again, looking for any sign, any person who might offer him some clarity. That's when he noticed the woman who had accused him earlier, standing with a group of others, their conversation too quiet for him to hear from across the room. She was still clutching her bracelet, a look of satisfaction on her face. She didn't seem worried, didn't seem to care about the damage she had done. In fact, she looked downright pleased. It was as if this entire spectacle was nothing more than a game to her. His blood boiled at the thought. She had lied, and everyone had believed her. But what if that wasn't all there was to it? What if she wasn't just an innocent bystander caught up in the chaos, but a player in a much larger scheme? Before he could make a move, a man approached him from the side, his voice low and urgent. "You don't want to get mixed up in this." The stranger's words were sharp, like a warning. "Leave now, while you still can." The man tensed. He had no idea who this person was, but the urgency in his voice caught his attention. Was this someone trying to help him, or was it just another piece of the puzzle he couldn't yet understand? "I'm not going anywhere," the man replied, his voice tight with frustration. "I need to know what's going on here." The stranger glanced around quickly, as if making sure no one was listening. "Listen," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "this is bigger than just you. It's about something. Something people will do anything to hide." The man's eyes narrowed, searching the stranger's face for any sign of honesty, but the man turned quickly, vanishing into the crowd as suddenly as he had appeared. The words hung in the air, unanswered, like a riddle waiting to be solved. There was no time to follow him. The man was on his own now. But his mind raced, piecing together fragments of information. The gala. The bracelet. The whispers. The stranger's cryptic warning. It was all connected somehow. But how? And why him? He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't some random, isolated incident. It felt personal. Someone had set him up. But who? And for what purpose? He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He had to focus. His every instinct screamed that he was being watched, but the truth was, he didn't know who to trust anymore. His reputation was crumbling by the second, and if he didn't find a way to turn things around soon, it would be too late. A low murmur broke his thoughts. The woman who had accused him earlier was approaching, her eyes narrowed with a predatory glint. She was no longer smiling. Instead, she wore an expression of cold resolve, as though she had already won. She stopped in front of him, her gaze unwavering. "I hope you've learned your lesson," she said, her voice low but with an undeniable edge. "You can't just show up at places like this and think you can get away with it." He couldn't believe what he was hearing. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice rising despite himself. "I didn't steal anything." Her lips curled into a thin smile, but it wasn't one of satisfaction. It was the kind of smile that came from knowing something he didn't. "You're not as clever as you think," she said, stepping closer to him, her voice almost a whisper. "You have no idea what you're really up against. But you will. Soon enough." Before he could react, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there, more confused and frustrated than ever. The last part of her words echoed in his mind. "You have no idea what you're really up against." What did that mean? Who was she? And why did it feel like the walls were closing in on him? The tension in the room had reached a fever pitch. The man knew he couldn't keep playing defense. He had to make a move, but he had no idea where to start. His thoughts were racing, each possibility more confusing than the last. Could someone be framing him? If so, why? Was it about the bracelet? Or was there something else at play? The man's gut told him this was more than just a petty theft accusation. This was something much deeper, something far more dangerous. But he needed answers. Fast. He forced himself to move, blending into the crowd as best he could, hoping to find someone, anyone, who might have answers. He moved through the throngs of people, each face a blur of judgment and suspicion. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath, waiting for the next chapter in this twisted story. His eyes landed on a familiar face, someone he hadn't noticed before but whose presence seemed to stand out among the rest. A man standing alone near the edge of the ballroom, his eyes flicking nervously from side to side, as though he was waiting for someone, or something. There was something about him that didn't feel right, something out of place. The man's gut instinct flared again. Was this person involved? Had he seen something? There was only one way to find out. The man moved toward him, trying to stay inconspicuous. But as he got closer, the stranger locked eyes with him for a split second, and in that instant, the man saw something in the stranger's expression that made his blood run cold. Fear. And then, just like that, the stranger disappeared into the crowd. Now, more than ever, he knew he was at the center of something that was bigger than he could have imagined. The man's heart pounded as he made his way deeper into the crowd, trying to make sense of everything, but nothing made sense. The whispers had grown louder, the stares more pointed. It felt like the walls were closing in on him with every passing second. He couldn't breathe. The very air seemed thick with suspicion. It was as if the room itself was conspiring against him. He had to get to the bottom of this. He couldn't keep running, couldn't keep pretending like he didn't know that something far darker was happening right in front of him. He spotted the stranger again, just a few feet away. The man was standing in the far corner of the ballroom, his face half hidden by shadows, watching everything unfold with a look of silent desperation. For a moment, their eyes locked. The man felt a rush of hope, as if this was the break he'd been waiting for. He started moving toward the stranger, his steps quick and determined. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away. But as he got closer, something strange happened. The stranger's eyes widened, panic flashing across his face, and before the man could take another step, the stranger turned and bolted toward the exit. The man cursed under his breath, pushing his way through the crowd, but it was no use. The stranger had already disappeared. Frustration surged through him. This was becoming impossible. It was as if everyone was playing a part in this twisted game, and he was the only one who hadn't received the memo. Who could he trust? Where was the truth? It seemed to slip further away the harder he searched for it. He needed answers. He needed to confront anyone who could tell him what was going on. His mind raced with possibilities. Could the woman who had accused him have known more than she let on? Was she working with someone? He replayed the moments in his mind, trying to pick up on something he had missed. But all he could think of was the cryptic warning the stranger had given him: "You have no idea what you're really up against." What did that even mean? What was happening here? His thoughts were interrupted by a loud commotion near the entrance. The sound of voices raised in anger, the shuffling of feet. He turned toward the noise, heart racing, and saw 2 security guards dragging a man out of the gala. It wasn't the stranger, but the scene caught his attention nonetheless. The man being escorted out looked disheveled, his eyes wide with panic. For a moment, the man's heart skipped a beat. Was this someone else who had been falsely accused? But then something else caught his eye. Among the crowd surrounding the exit was the woman who had accused him. She was standing at the center of the commotion, watching the scene unfold with a look of detached satisfaction. She wasn't just a bystander. She was orchestrating this. It was impossible to ignore the way she was carefully positioned, as if she had a direct line of control over the whole situation. He felt a surge of anger rise within him. He was being set up, manipulated, played like a puppet. But why? And by who? The questions kept piling up, and each answer seemed to make the puzzle even more complicated. Was this all part of a larger scheme? A conspiracy, perhaps? He couldn't trust anyone. Not anymore. As the man tried to get a better look, a cold shiver ran down his spine. From the corner of his eye, he saw something that made his blood run cold: a shadow moving in the distance. Someone watching him. It wasn't the security guards, not the woman, not anyone from the gala. No, this was someone new. Someone who seemed to be following him, just out of sight, always keeping their distance. The man's instincts screamed at him to move, to get out, but the crowd was thick, and he was trapped. He turned to leave, but the shadow grew closer, closer than ever before. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He quickened his pace, weaving through the sea of people, trying to lose whoever was tailing him. But the steps behind him didn't falter. They were close. Too close. Suddenly he was grabbed from behind firm, but not enough to make him panic. He whipped around, his breath catching in his throat, only to find himself face to face with a man whose expression was hard to read. His face was obscured by a hood, and his voice was low, barely audible over the noise of the party. "You don't want to go out there." "Not yet." The man's pulse quickened. Who was this? How did he know about what was happening? "Who are you?" he demanded, trying to break free from the stranger's grip. The stranger's grip tightened, but not painfully. "Doesn't matter. You need to stay inside. You need to listen to me." The man's thoughts raced. What could this stranger possibly want with him? He had no answers, no promises. He was just as lost as the man who had been dragged out by the security guards. "I'm not going anywhere until I know the truth." The stranger's eyes darkened, and he looked around quickly, scanning the room for anyone who might be watching them. He pulled the man aside, out of the main crowd and into a small alcove where they were hidden from view. "They're watching you." "All of them," he said, his voice urgent. "I don't have much time. You have to listen to me carefully." The man's chest tightened. What was this? What had he stumbled into? He had so many questions, but he couldn't afford to waste any more time. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why is everyone trying to frame me? What do they want?" The stranger looked around one more time, making sure no one was close enough to hear, then leaned in. "This isn't just about you. It's about something much bigger, something that goes way beyond this gala. You were never supposed to be here tonight. But they didn't count on you being so persistent." He paused, swallowing hard, his face tense with worry. "They've been setting up people like you for years. People who get too close to the truth. They'll stop at nothing to keep it hidden." The man's mind raced. "People like me? What truth?" Before he could speak, the stranger took a step back, his face suddenly hardening. "I can't say more, not here. But you need to get out now. If you don't, you won't make it out of here." Just as he said that, a loud crash echoed from the other side of the ballroom, followed by shouts. The commotion was escalating again. The stranger's face twisted with fear. "They're coming," he said, backing away into the shadows. "You need to run. Now. Get out of here before they make you disappear." The man didn't hesitate. He knew now that this was more than just a misunderstanding. Something darker was at play, something that was going to explode in front of him. The tension was unbearable. His mind screamed at him to flee, but where could he go? Who could he trust? He turned and dashed toward the exit, his legs moving faster than they ever had before. The chaos around him was intensifying, but he could feel the weight of the danger bearing down on him. It was coming to a head, and everything, his life, his future, everything was about to change. But how? The man's breath was ragged as he pushed through the crowd, moving as quickly as he dared without drawing attention. His heart hammered against his ribs, and his mind spun in 100 different directions. The chaos in the ballroom seemed to reach a boiling point. It was no longer just a matter of proving his innocence, it was about survival. The stranger's words echoed in his mind, "You need to run. Get out before they make you disappear." But he couldn't just leave. Not when he had no idea who they were or what he had stumbled into. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with the sense that something catastrophic was just on the horizon. He had to find answers, or else this whole night would end in disaster. But as he neared the exit, something stopped him in his tracks. A security guard stepped into his path, blocking his way with a grim expression. "Where do you think you're going?" the guard asked, his voice cold. The man's stomach twisted. There was no way this was a coincidence. The guard was too calm, too certain of his role in this. "I'm leaving," the man replied, trying to keep his voice steady despite the fear creeping up his spine. The guard's eyes narrowed. "Not so fast. You're not going anywhere." Before he could react, another figure emerged from the shadows, one he didn't expect. It was the woman who had accused him earlier, standing tall and proud, with a triumphant look on her face. She was no longer playing the role of an innocent victim. She was in control, and it was clear now that the situation was far more complicated than he had first realized. "You didn't think it would be that easy, did you?" she said, her voice smooth and almost mocking. "You've made a lot of mistakes tonight. And now you're going to pay for them." His blood ran cold. Pay for them? What was she talking about? What had he done? "Let him go," he demanded, his voice rising with a mix of anger and desperation. "This is all a lie. You're framing me." She gave him a look of pity, almost amused. "You still don't get it, do you? You're not the one in control here. And neither are they." She gestured to the security guards, who remained silent, their eyes hard and unyielding. "This is bigger than you. Bigger than anyone here." The man's heart skipped a beat. This was it. The moment where everything he thought he knew about the night, about the people around him, was shattered into 1,000 pieces. He had been played, but by who? And for what? "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice shaking with a mix of confusion and anger. "What do you want from me?" She stepped closer, her eyes locking onto his with a calculating intensity. "What I want," she said slowly, "is for you to understand the truth. You've been a pawn in a much larger game, and now you're about to find out just how deep it goes. The people behind this, behind everything, they're not who you think they are. And they don't play by the same rules as everyone else." A cold chill ran down the man's spine. The more she spoke, the more it became clear that this wasn't just some isolated incident at a fancy gala. This was part of something much larger, something far more dangerous. Something that could cost him everything. The security guard moved toward him, grabbing his arm tightly. "Enough talking," the guard said, his grip tightening. "You're coming with us." But just as the man prepared to resist, he saw something that made his blood freeze, a flash of something in the woman's hand. A small, sleek device, one that seemed too sophisticated for someone like her to possess. She pressed a button, and for a split second, everything went dark. The man's breath caught in his throat as the entire room was plunged into complete darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. His heart raced in his chest, and he felt an unsettling chill creep through his veins. What was happening? Was this a trap? And then, like a burst of light, the emergency lights flickered on, casting everything in an eerie, dim glow. But when his eyes adjusted, he saw something that nearly made his legs give way beneath him. The woman, the security guard, and everyone else in the room were gone. For a moment, he thought he was imagining it. That the stress of the night had finally pushed him to the edge. But no. There was no one around him. The ballroom, once filled with chatter and music, was now completely silent, save for the faint hum of the emergency lights. The walls seemed to close in around him as a suffocating sense of isolation gripped him. It was like he had been dropped into a parallel world, one where nothing made sense. His mind raced. Had they all disappeared? Or had he been moved? Where was everyone? And more importantly, where was the woman? In the eerie quiet, he heard a sound that snapped him back to reality, a single, sharp click. The sound of a door unlocking. He turned toward the sound, his body tensing in anticipation, but there was no one in sight. Then, slowly, a door he hadn't noticed before creaked open. Out of the shadows stepped someone he had never expected to see. The man who had warned him earlier, the one who had spoken in hushed tones about getting out and staying hidden. He was standing in the doorway now, looking just as urgent as before, his face drawn with fear. "Come with me," he said quickly, his voice trembling. "There's no time. They'll be back soon." The man didn't hesitate. He had no idea what was going on, but if anyone knew what was happening, it was this stranger. The stakes had never been higher. The danger was closing in, and the truth, whatever it was slipping further and further out of reach. As the man followed the stranger down the hallway, his mind was a whirlwind of unanswered questions. Why had the room emptied out so suddenly? What was the device the woman had used to plunge the room into darkness? And why had this stranger appeared again, just when things were reaching their breaking point? He didn't know, but one thing was certain: whatever game was being played, he was at the center of it. And the deeper he went, the more he realized that the only way out was to uncover the truth. But with every twist, every turn, he felt the walls closing in tighter. Something had shifted. The rules had changed. And now, there was no going back. The stranger led him down a narrow hallway, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. Each step felt like it carried them further from reality, as if they were moving into a space beyond anyone's control. The man's heart pounded with every passing moment, every unanswered question threatening to overwhelm him. He needed to know why he was being dragged into this twisted web, who had set him up, and most importantly, what had really happened to the woman who had accused him. They reached a door at the end of the corridor. The stranger glanced over his shoulder, making sure they were still undetected. With a sharp breath, he pushed the door open, revealing a small, dimly lit room. A single table sat in the center, and on it lay a series of monitors, each showing a different view of the gala. But it wasn't just the footage from tonight. It was live footage, streaming from multiple events, places, and even people. The man's mind raced. What was this? What was happening? The stranger shut the door quietly behind them and motioned to the screens. "This is where it all connects," he said, his voice low. "Everything you've seen tonight, everything you've been a part of, it's all part of a much larger operation. This isn't just about you. It's about control. It's about keeping power in the hands of a select few." The man stepped closer, his gaze flicking between the monitors. He could see the faces of the people at the gala, the security guards, the woman who had accused him. It was like a puzzle, but one where the pieces were constantly shifting. "I don't understand," he said, his voice trembling with frustration. "Who are these people? What do they want from me?" The stranger's expression darkened. "They're the ones who control everything." The gala wasn't just a fancy event. It was a test. A test to see who could be manipulated, who could be controlled. And you were their prime target. He stepped aside, motioning toward a corner of the room where a large file lay open. It was filled with documents, pictures, and names. As the man glanced over it, he recognized some of the names, people he had met earlier, those who had been at the gala. But what shocked him the most was the name written at the very top of the list. The woman. She wasn't just an innocent bystander. She was part of the plan. She had always been part of it. The stranger saw the recognition in his eyes and nodded grimly. "She's one of them. One of the key players. She knew exactly how to play you. She knew exactly what strings to pull to get you involved." The man took a step back, his mind reeling. But why? Why me? The stranger looked at him with a mixture of sympathy and regret. Because you were close to the truth. You had something they couldn't afford for you to uncover. You were the perfect candidate to make sure everything stayed hidden. They needed someone like you to expose the cracks, but only so they could control how it all came out. You were a tool, nothing more. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. All of it, the accusations, the false evidence, the traps, had been orchestrated from the start. And he had walked right into it. His entire life had been manipulated, his every move calculated to serve someone else's agenda. As he stood there, the full weight of the conspiracy crashing down on him, something in the back of his mind clicked. The monitors. The security footage. The people watching. This wasn't just about a single gala or a single plot. This was about a network, a system designed to control and manipulate people on a scale he couldn't even begin to fathom. He turned back to the stranger, his eyes wide with realization. You said they would come for me. Who are they? The stranger hesitated, glancing nervously at the door. It's not just them, he said quietly. There's a whole system. A whole group of people who've been pulling the strings behind the scenes. But even I don't know the full extent of it. I was only a small part of the operation. A pawn, just like you. Just as the man opened his mouth to respond, the door slammed open with a deafening crash. 2 security guards stepped into the room, their faces cold and unreadable. The man instinctively backed away, but the stranger stood his ground. This is it, he whispered. They've found us. The security guards didn't speak. They just moved forward, their hands reaching for the man, the tension thick in the air. The man's instincts kicked in. Without thinking, he pushed past one of the guards and bolted for the door. But just as his fingers brushed the handle, the woman stepped into the room, her eyes cold and emotionless. You didn't think you could escape, did you? She said, her voice as sharp as ever. The man froze, his heart sinking. It was all a game. A game where he was the only one who didn't know the rules. Before he could react, the woman pressed a button on her wrist, and suddenly, the room was flooded with light. The guards lunged toward him, but in that split second, he saw something that made his blood run cold, a face he recognized. The stranger, the one who had been guiding him, warning him, wasn't the person he appeared to be. His expression twisted into a smirk, his eyes glinting with something far more sinister. You, the man breathed, his voice shaking. You were in on it the whole time. The stranger didn't answer. Instead, he stepped back, allowing the guards to seize the man, pulling his arms behind him with brutal force. The woman's face twisted into a cruel smile as she stepped closer. You were always meant to be a distraction, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. A pawn to keep them busy while we carried out our real plan. The man's mind raced. He had been manipulated from the beginning, pulled into a trap designed to break him. But as he was dragged away, his mind snapped back to one final thought. The file. The names. There were more people out there. More players in this twisted game, more pieces in this grand scheme. And somewhere, buried deep within the chaos, was the truth. But it was too late for him to uncover it now. As the guards pushed him down the dark hallway, the woman's voice echoed in his ears one last time. It's over. You're just another casualty in the game. And as the door slammed shut behind him, the man realized he had only just begun to understand the true scope of the conspiracy he had become a part of. And the worst part was, it wasn't over for him. Not by a long shot. As the door slammed shut behind him, the man's heart raced, a cold sweat creeping down his spine. His world had just turned upside down in the span of mere minutes. He had been played. Used. The woman, the one who had accused him of stealing, the one who seemed so innocent, had been a puppet master, pulling the strings from the very beginning. And the stranger, the one who had seemed like a lifeline in a night full of confusion, was nothing more than another piece in the puzzle, a piece he had been too blind to see. His mind spun as he was dragged down the narrow hallway. There were so many unanswered questions, so many pieces of the story left scattered around him. Who was behind all of this? What was the ultimate goal? And most importantly, why him? Why had they chosen him to be the target of their elaborate scheme? The answers seemed just out of reach, taunting him. He tried to focus, tried to piece everything together, but the cold grip of fear clouded his thoughts. The guards' grip on his arms tightened as they led him through the darkened corridors, the sound of their footsteps echoing ominously in the silence. As they approached a steel door, the guards stopped and one of them signaled for the man to be pushed inside. The door creaked open, revealing a stark, sterile room that felt like a holding cell. The man was thrown inside with little care, his body crashing against the cold concrete floor. He lay there for a moment, dazed, the sting of the fall fading as he tried to get his bearings. He had no idea what was going to happen to him next, but one thing was certain: he wasn't going to let them break him. He couldn't. He wouldn't. The door slammed shut behind him, leaving him alone in the silence. He pushed himself to his feet, his body aching from the harsh treatment. But despite the pain, his mind was racing. He needed to escape. He needed to find a way out of this nightmare. As he paced the small room, his thoughts flashed back to the gala. The woman. The stranger. The security guards. All of it. What was the point of it all? What were they trying to accomplish? He could feel the pieces starting to fall into place, but they were still jumbled, incomplete. And then it hit him: the file. The one with the names. The people who had been watching, pulling the strings, orchestrating every moment of this twisted game. He hadn't been just a random victim in all of this. He had been a part of something much bigger, something far more dangerous. And whatever it wasn't over yet. He had to find out what was in that file. The truth was locked away in those documents, and he was going to have to fight tooth and nail to uncover it. The thought of escaping this place, of finding the answers, gave him a renewed sense of determination. He couldn't give up now. Just as he was about to make his move, the door opened again. The woman stepped inside, her eyes cold and distant. She didn't seem surprised to see him, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of something else in her eyes, a hint of regret, maybe, or even guilt. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by the same icy demeanor she had shown earlier. "You've made this harder than it needed to be," she said, her voice flat. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied her, trying to read her expression. She had been so sure of herself before, so confident in her control over him. But now, something was different. He could sense the shift, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. "I don't understand," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Why me? Why all of this?" She sighed, looking down for a moment before meeting his gaze once again. "You were never supposed to get this far," she said, her voice tinged with something almost like regret. "You were just a pawn, part of a much bigger plan. But you kept digging. You kept pushing, and now I have to deal with you." The man frowned. "Deal with me? What does that mean?" She smiled then, a cold, knowing smile. "It means you're no longer part of the game. You were useful, but now you're a liability." The man's pulse quickened. "What happens now?" She didn't answer immediately, as if considering something. Then, she stepped closer to him. "You're going to stay here. You'll be forgotten. You'll fade into the background, just like everyone else who's been a part of this." The words hit him like a punch to the gut. "That's it?" he demanded. "You're just going to leave me here?" Her smile widened, but it was empty. "That's the way it works," It's how the game is played. You were never meant to be anything more than a pawn. And now, you're not even worth keeping around. Before he could respond, the door swung open once more. This time, it wasn't the guards. It was the stranger. The man who had warned him earlier, the one who had appeared out of nowhere and told him to run. But now, there was no sign of the urgency or fear he had seen in him before. The stranger's face was unreadable, his expression cold as he stepped into the room. "You," the man said, his voice filled with disbelief. "You were a part of this all along." The stranger didn't respond at first. He simply nodded, as though accepting the man's realization. "I told you before. This is bigger than both of us. And now it's over. It's too late for you." The man's mind spun. There were too many questions, too many unanswered mysteries. Who were these people? What was their endgame? And why had they gone to such lengths to destroy him? He had thought he was close to finding the truth, but now, it seemed more elusive than ever. But just as despair began to creep in, a thought flashed in his mind. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to turn the tables on them. He wasn't going to just sit here and let them control his fate. Suddenly, there was a loud crash from the other side of the room. The man's heart skipped a beat as he turned toward the noise. The door to the room burst open, and in rushed a group of people. His mind barely had time to register their presence before they were on him, pulling him away from the woman and the stranger. For a moment, everything was chaos. Shouts filled the air as the man struggled, trying to break free from the grip of the new arrivals. But as he looked around, he realized something: these people weren't here to hurt him. They were here to save him. "We've been watching," one of them said, her voice urgent. "We've been monitoring the situation, and we knew you were in danger. You're not alone in this." The man's heart raced as he tried to make sense of it all. "Who are you? What's happening?" "We're the ones who've been trying to stop them," the woman said. "The ones who've been pulling the strings behind all of this. The ones who've been trying to take down the system from the inside. And now we need you." The man stared at her, his mind reeling. This was it. This was the moment. The pieces were finally falling into place. The truth had been there all along, hidden just out of reach. As the group ushered him out of the room and into the safety of their care, the man realized something. The game wasn't over. It had only just begun. And now, he was no longer a pawn. He was a player. The last thing he saw before the door slammed shut behind him was the woman and the stranger, their faces locked in a tense standoff. The game was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a chance. And as the door closed, sealing him into his new reality, he couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. The truth had been buried, but it was out there. And he was going to find it no matter what it took.